Hello, friends. You're watching Bedtime Adventure. I invite you to relax and listen to an incredible story about the conquest of the legendary mountain, Annapurna. Imagine a mountain towering at 8,091 meters. It rises above the clouds, its slopes covered in eternal snow, its peak hidden in mist. This is Annapurna, one of the deadliest mountains in the world. It's one of the 14 8,000ers, but its height isn't what makes it legendary. Annapurna is infamous for the sheer number of climbers who never made it back. Statistically, about 1 in 3 people who have attempted to conquer it never returned. Today, we're diving into the story of the first ascent of Annapurna. And trust me, you'll be shocked at what these climbers managed to do 75 years ago. Now picture this. You're about to cross an unexplored frozen wasteland, but you have no lightweight oxygen tanks, no high-tech clothing, no satellite communication, no maps, no established routes, no experience on anything like this. Your gear? It's barely suitable for a basic trekking trip, let alone climbing one of the most dangerous peaks on Earth. Got that image in your head? Now let's talk about how it really happened. 1950. The world is slowly recovering from World War II. People are returning to normal life, but the hunger for discovery and new achievements is still alive. A group of French climbers, inspired by the legends of the Himalayas, sets out to do the impossible, to conquer Annapurna. At this point, no one has ever summited an 8,000-meter peak. Annapurna is an untouched dream, a mountain so unexplored that even reaching its base is an expedition in itself. And yet, against all odds, they go for it. Leading the expedition was Maurice Herzog, a man who was already a legend, a politician, a writer, a soldier, but above all, a passionate mountaineer, known for his relentless determination and absolute fearlessness. He wasn't just a leader, he was an inspiration. Herzog believed that the limits of human potential exist only in our minds, and he was ready to prove it. His team, future legends, Louis Lachenal, Gaston Rebouffat, Lionel Terray, some of the greatest climbers of their time. But their goal wasn't just to reach the summit. They wanted to prove that the human spirit could overcome anything. We dreamed of something grand, a peak that would become a symbol of our courage and determination, Herzog later wrote. Originally, the expedition wasn't even supposed to climb Annapurna. Their first target was Dhaulagiri, another 8,000-meter giant in Nepal. But when they scouted the route, they quickly realized it was practically impossible. The approach alone was a nightmare. Sheer ice falls, vertical cliffs, a route so dangerous that even the most experienced climbers saw little chance of survival. Annapurna, on the other hand, was still completely unexplored. No one had ever mapped a way to the summit. But one thing was clear, it gave them a better shot. The southern slopes looked more manageable, and that was enough. The decision was made. They were going to Annapurna. We knew Annapurna was dangerous, Herzog recalled. But did that stop us? We were ready to risk everything to make history. And so began one of the most dramatic and heroic expeditions of the 20th century. But what did it really take to pull off such a feat? What kind of preparation was needed to conquer a mountain that was considered impossible? It all started with Herzog as the expedition leader, carefully selecting his team. And make no mistake, this wasn't just a strategic decision. It was a matter of life and death. Each of us was unique, Herzog wrote in his memoirs. Lachenal was calm and level-headed. Rebuffat was unbelievably strong and resilient. Terray was a fighter to the core. We all had our strengths, and together we made the perfect team. Back then, mountaineering gear was far from perfect. Every single piece of equipment had to be scrutinized down to the smallest detail. Ropes, tents, oxygen tanks, these weren't just supplies. They were lifelines. We argued for hours, Herzog recalled. Which rope should we take? How much oxygen would we need? What food should we pack? Every decision mattered. Every mistake could mean disaster. And oxygen was everything. At such altitudes, it wasn't just a luxury. It was a weapon, one that could save them or fail them completely. Beyond technical challenges, Herzog and his team faced another major obstacle: funding. Finding sponsors, negotiating with governments, reaching out to private investors. It all required tremendous effort. Today, a commercial expedition to Annapurna costs around $19,000 for 41 days. But back in 1950, Herzog's expedition likely cost several times more in today's money, factoring in inflation, the cost of specialized gear, and the enormous logistical challenges. Getting to the mountain was no easy feat. Today, it's simple. Book a flight, hire a Sherpa, and within days, you're at base camp. But in March 1950, things were very different. Here's what their journey actually looked like. March 1950. 8 French climbers and a handful of assistants set out on a mission to do what no one before them had ever done: to become the first humans to conquer an 8,000-meter peak. There were no grand send-offs, no speeches, just a few quiet goodbyes, handshakes, embraces. Herzog later wrote, "We knew we were heading into a long and dangerous journey. But at that moment, all we felt was anticipation." They were leaving for who knows how long, maybe forever. The journey began with a train ride to Marseille. Hours in a cramped carriage, talking about the route, the challenges ahead. One last taste of the world they knew. No one could predict how this expedition would end, but no one doubted for a second that they had to try. From Marseille, they set sail for India. 2 weeks on a ship, crossing the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. It was a strange limbo, confined to a small space with nothing to do but think. Time was spent poring over maps, discussing strategies, imagining the mountain that awaited them. We talked about the mountains, about the difficulties ahead, about how important it was to stay together, Herzog recalled. And when the talking stopped, training began, running laps on the deck, lifting weights, pushing their bodies to the limit. There would be no warm-ups in the Himalayas. They had to be ready to fight from the very first step. Finally, Bombay, their first stop in Asia. a city that felt utterly foreign. The sweltering heat, the thick aroma of spices and street food, the honking cars, the shouts of merchants. Nothing like the quiet streets of France. But there was no time to linger. From Bombay, they boarded a train to Delhi. That's where the first major roadblock hit: bureaucracy. They couldn't enter Nepal without the proper permits. Days lost, endless waiting, negotiations, stacks of paperwork. Frustrating, but unavoidable. Once the documents were in hand, the real journey began. The road to Nepal took several days, by train, by bus, and finally, on foot. As they traveled, the scenery transformed. Paved roads disappeared, replaced by dirt trails winding through the mountains. Each day, the peaks grew higher, the air thinner, and Annapurna felt closer. We could feel our hearts start to race. The mountains were coming, Herzog later wrote. Arriving in Kathmandu, they were met with smiles and curious stares. Europeans were a rare sight here. There were only a few days to prepare, stock up on supplies, hire porters, finalize the route. Then, the real challenge began. The march toward Annapurna. The caravan snaked through narrow trails, crossing deep valleys and towering mountain passes, scorching heat by day, freezing cold by night, steep ascents, treacherous descents. The order of movement was always the same. Local guides led the way, porters followed, and finally, the climbers. Every day was a cycle. Wake up, break camp, hike, set up camp again. We could have enjoyed the beauty of nature if not for the exhaustion, Herzog admitted. At first, the road was tough, but manageable. Then the real problems began. Some of the porters refused to go any further. The unknown ahead terrifies them. Local villagers speak of the mountain spirits, warning that Annapurna should not be disturbed. No amount of persuasion works. Precious time is lost as the team searches for replacements, redistributes supplies, and carries more weight themselves. And the gear? Far from perfect. The ropes aren't as strong as they had hoped. Some tents barely hold up against the cold and wind. Every flaw slows them down, raises tensions, makes success feel just a little more out of reach. But then, after weeks of struggle, they finally see it. Annapurna. No one speaks. They just stand there, staring. She was so grand, so unreachable, Herzog later wrote. We looked at her and understood. Soon, we would be up there. It was thrilling and terrifying at the same time. They finally reached the spot where they'll establish their base camp. The summit is still far, far away, but this is where the real fight begins. The camp is set up at the foot of the mountain, in a spot sheltered from the wind. It has to be a safe place, a place they can rely on in the coming weeks. This was our refuge, Herzog recalled, a place where we could safely set up our tents and store our equipment. The work starts immediately. Tents go up, gear is unpacked. For the first time in weeks, they get a proper hot meal. Nobody waits for instructions. Everyone knows what to do. One entry in Herzog's journal reads, It was exhausting work, but we did it gladly. We understood this would be our home for the next few weeks. Next priority? Acclimatization. The higher they climb, the less oxygen there is. Without proper adaptation, the body doesn't just weaken, it can shut down entirely. The team starts short climbs to adjust, scouting the terrain, looking for possible routes. Every night, they gather to discuss the plan. We talked about every turn, every danger, every place where we could set up higher camps, Herzog later wrote. Every decision had to be made together. They were one step closer. But despite all the planning and endless discussions, the real problems began fast. The altitude was draining their strength. The cold cut deep into their bones. Winds tore at their tents. Every day, the lack of oxygen became more noticeable. Fatigue, weakness, nausea. Each of them felt it creeping in. But there was no turning back. And then there was the food. It wasn't enough. They had to start rationing. Every meal was worth its weight in gold, Herzog wrote. We thought our supplies would last, but each day it became clear we had to stretch them as long as possible. After several days of acclimatization, the team began their final push. They had to navigate glaciers, sheer cliffs, and death zones where a single mistake could be the last. Every step was a test, Herzog wrote. We moved forward despite the exhaustion, the cold, and the fear. The glacier was the most treacherous obstacle yet. The ice was deceptive, slick, riddled with deep crevasses. Every step felt like walking on a tightrope. We moved slowly, cautiously. There was no room for error. To avoid making the grueling descent back to base camp every time, the team established several high-altitude camps. These would serve as stepping stones toward the summit. We searched for places where the snow was firm enough to hold our tents, where the slope was protected from avalanches, Herzog recalled. But setting up those camps was a battle in itself. It wasn't just work, it was a fight against altitude, freezing temperatures, exhaustion. They hauled tents, food, oxygen tanks, each step heavier than the last. Every movement took effort, but we knew we had to do it, Herzog wrote. The route demanded total focus. One wrong step could mean the end. One day, Lachenal slipped. He nearly vanished into a crevasse. Someone grabbed him just in time. After that, they became even more careful. We realized that in the mountains, it's not just about skill or strength. The most important thing is trust, Herzog wrote. They knew the summit was still far away, but by now, one thing was clear. There was no turning back. With the final preparations complete, the team was ready to push for the summit. Sounds straightforward, right? Just like today, climbers gear up and make their way to the top. Not even close. Imagine this. You've traveled all the way from France to Nepal. You've endured weeks of freezing nights, exhaustion, and near starvation just to get this far. Now, finally, it's time for the final ascent. You're ready. You're focused. But there's one problem. You have no idea which way to go. There is no established route. No previous climbers to guide you. Nothing. In this brutally exhausted state, you have to find the way yourself. and the team sets out. Their first mission? Reconnaissance. They split into groups, searching for a path that will take them to the top without killing them in the process. We knew we had to find the safest and most efficient route, Herzog later wrote. That was the key to success. Every night back at camp, they regroup to discuss the day's findings. The tension is high. Then Lachenal speaks up. We have to be careful, but we can't be afraid to take risks. That's the only way we'll reach the summit. His words cut through the exhaustion. They needed to hear that. The search for a route takes days. They push forward through glaciers, sheer cliffs, endless snowfields. The temperature plummets. The altitude eats away at their strength. Every step was a test, Herzog wrote. We kept moving forward despite the exhaustion and cold. We knew we had to do this. There was no other choice. The glacier becomes a serious problem. It's deceptive. Crevasses lurk beneath thin layers of snow. The ice is slick. Every step could be the last. They move slowly, cautiously, hacking out a path with their ice axes. One wrong step, and it's over. To save energy, they set up high-altitude camps. The locations have to be perfect, safe from avalanches, shielded from the wind. But getting them established is brutal. They haul gear, tents, food, oxygen tanks. Every ounce of weight feels heavier in the thin air. They manage to set up the camps, but they don't get lucky with their summit pushes. Annapurna won't give in. Herzog writes about how the team hit roadblock after roadblock. Annapurna wasn't going to surrender easily. One of the biggest problems? The weather. Storms hit without warning. Winds howled. Snow blinded them. And remember, this was 1950. Their gear wasn't built for conditions this extreme. Visibility dropped. The temperature plummeted below 30 degrees. They had no choice. The only way to survive: stay together. In these conditions, breaking down is not an option. The team keeps each other moving. When someone weakens, they step in, holding them up, dragging them forward. There were moments when we felt like we were at our limit, Herzog wrote. But we knew we had to keep going, no matter what. One evening at camp, Rebuffa finally says what everyone else is thinking. Sometimes I feel like we'll never reach the summit. Silence. No one argues, but no one stops preparing for the next day's climb either. After several failed attempts, the team finally finds a way up. The last high-altitude camp is set at 7,600 meters. Above them, only the summit. This is their last chance. The weather is unstable. Time is running out. They have to move fast. The last night before the summit. They gather in the tent to discuss the final plan. Lachenal is certain. We go at sunrise. If we wait, we lose our chance. His confidence spreads through the team. They all know there's no turning back. The night is restless. Everyone checks and rechecks their gear. Knots are retied. Carabiners tested. Ropes inspected. One mistake tomorrow could mean death. The only sounds in the darkness, heavy breathing and the dull thud of ice axes sinking into the snow. Herzog and Lachenal don't sleep. They sit in silence, each lost in thought. They know that tomorrow is the most important day of their lives. Excitement, fear, adrenaline. Everything blurs together. If they want to make history, tomorrow, they have to reach the top. Before dawn, Herzog and Lachenal leave the camp. The cold cuts through them like a knife. The air is thin, their strength nearly gone. They move in darkness, their headlamps casting weak beams on the frozen ground. One mistake could mean death, but stopping is not an option. The weather is against them. The wind slashes at their faces, gusts knock them off balance. It feels like the cold has seeped inside them, like they'll never be warm again. But they keep climbing. Then, the glacier, the hardest obstacle yet. The ice is slick, treacherous. Deep crevasses lie hidden beneath the snow. Every step is a test of focus. They carve their way forward with ice axes, crampons biting into fragile ice. A single misstep, a second of lost concentration, and it's over. They move slowly, deliberately. There is no room for error. Oxygen is running low. Dizziness sets in. Muscles scream in pain. Every movement feels impossible. But the summit, it's getting closer. Then they see it. It's right there. The last few meters are the hardest. Their bodies beg to collapse. But ahead, only sky, emptiness, the end of the road. They don't speak. They just keep moving. And then, the summit. Herzog and Lachenal stand at 8,091 meters. Herzog later described the moment with overwhelming emotion. We stood on the summit, and the world lay at our feet. We did it. We conquered Annapurna. Silence. The wind howls over the snow, but inside, there is nothing but pure, absolute victory. They embrace. No words, no energy left to celebrate, just the realization that it was all worth it. For a brief moment, all the suffering, fear, and pain seemed to vanish. Nothing remains but one undeniable truth. They have made history. But history doesn't matter if they don't make it down alive. And that fleeting euphoria, it's an illusion. The moment they leave the summit, reality crashes down on them. They are already dying. Herzog and Lachenal begin their descent, but within hours, it's clear. Their bodies are failing. Their hands and feet go numb. Frostbite. No doubt about it. The pain is relentless. But the worst part is the creeping realization that they may not make it back. We reached the summit, but now I realized I might never make it home, Herzog later wrote. Lachenal understands it too. Normally calm and collected, now he is silent. His toes have turned black. Every step is agony. Every meter down is a battle. Down at camp, their teammates are waiting. Lionel Terray, one of the strongest climbers in the group, immediately sees the truth. There's no time. If Herzog and Lachenal don't descend right now, they will die. "We have to go now," Therese says. "Tomorrow will be too late." The descent turns into a nightmare. Herzog can barely see. Snow blindness has taken hold. Lachenal is barely on his feet, his consciousness slipping away. Thérèse and Gaston Rébuffat grab them by the arms, first guiding them, then dragging them. The wind knocks them off balance. Snow blinds them. Oxygen is running out. Breathing feels like a battle. That night, they stop for a rest. The only sound is the heavy breathing of exhausted men. In the darkness, Lachenal whispers, "Maurice, I didn't think it would be this hard. I don't know if I can keep going." The words hang in the freezing air. Herzog is barely holding himself up but forces out a response. "We have to. We don't have a choice." The next day, Lachenal can no longer walk. Thérèse and Rébuffat fashion a makeshift stretcher. The thought of dragging a man down a glacier when they themselves are barely holding on is almost impossible. But they don't hesitate. "We're a team. We do this together," Thérèse says. Herzog watches them and feels the weight of guilt. "Because of me, they are risking their lives," he thinks. But deep down, he knows they would never leave him behind. That night, a miracle. They find tracks, the ones they had left on their way up. A thin, fragile trail leading downward. "We followed those tracks like Ariadne's thread," Herzog later wrote. But even with a path, the descent is hell. Herzog loses consciousness from exhaustion. Lachenal is barely responsive. Thérèse and Rébuffat, on the brink of collapse themselves, keep dragging them down. "If we stop, we die," Herzog writes. That single thought keeps them moving. After several grueling days of descent, they finally reach base camp. The remaining team members rush toward them, relief flooding their faces. But the joy doesn't last. One look at Herzog and Lachenal, and they know this is bad. Their hands and feet have turned black. Without immediate medical help, they won't survive. Thérèse, despite being completely exhausted himself, takes charge. "We can't waste time. Every hour counts." The team mobilizes. The goal is no longer reaching the summit. The goal is survival. Drained, battered, barely holding on, they reach a small Nepalese village. It's the first stop where they can receive any medical attention, but it's not enough. There are no doctors, no real treatment. Herzog and Lachenal are in critical condition. Their limbs are dead from frostbite. It's clear, without amputation, they will die. Lying on a stretcher, Herzog stares at the sky. He realizes reaching the summit was only half the battle. "We conquered the peak, but now I understood. The real fight was just beginning," he later wrote. Lachenal says nothing. He doesn't have to. He knows. Their lives will never be the same. Before leaving the Himalayas, the team holds a farewell ritual. They stand at the base of the mountain that nearly killed them and gaze upward one last time. We looked at her, and in our eyes there was not just pride, but gratitude. Herzog recalled. Annapurna had changed them forever. She had taught them what it truly meant to be human. Terray, usually composed, doesn't hide his emotions this time. He stares up at Annapurna, his face heavy with exhaustion, and finally speaks. "We did it, but I will never forget the price we paid." Those words would become the epitaph of their return. The journey home, a different kind of battle. Getting back wasn't a relief. It was another test of endurance. Herzog and Lachenal were barely clinging to life. Every train ride, every flight, every transfer was an ordeal. Their teammates, though in better condition, were just as drained, physically, mentally, emotionally. At one airport, a stranger approaches them. His eyes are full of admiration. "You're the men who conquered Annapurna?" he asks. "You're heroes." The words should have felt good, but Herzog only feels bitterness. Heroes? He thinks. We were just people trying to survive. When their plane lands in France, the world is waiting. Crowds, journalists, flashing cameras, cheers. They're expected to smile, to celebrate. But inside, only emptiness. The hardest moment comes when they face their families. Herzog sees his mother look at his mutilated hands. She bursts into tears. He wants to say it's okay, that he's alive, that it was worth it. But the words never come. Beside him, Lachenal stands in silence. His family watches him, waiting for something, some reassurance, some meaning. But in his eyes, there's only one question. How do you live after this? When the noise of celebrations and ceremonies fades, reality sinks in. On June 3, 1950, Maurice Herzog and Louis Lachenal became the first humans to conquer an 8,000-meter peak, reaching the summit of Annapurna. But their success came at an unbearable price. Severe frostbite took all of Lachenal's toes. Herzog lost nearly all his fingers and toes. But the physical wounds weren't the worst part. The true scars ran deeper. "A part of me stayed up there, on the summit," Herzog later wrote. "And I don't know if I'll ever get it back." One night he turns to Terray and asks, "Do you think it was worth it? We reached the summit, but we lost so much." Terray doesn't hesitate. "It was worth it. We proved that a person can overcome anything, as long as they have the will to live." Herzog spends a long time thinking about those words. What does it really mean to be a hero? It's not just about reaching the top. It's about finding a way to keep going, even when there's nothing left inside. One day, a doctor tells him, "You lost your fingers, but you kept your life. And that's what matters most." These words become the epilogue to the entire story. Annapurna took so much from him, but in return, it gave him something greater. It showed him that no matter the pain, no matter the loss, life is still worth living. It would be 2 decades before anyone dared to challenge Annapurna again. Can you imagine? The first and second successful ascents were separated by 20 years. Between them, only a handful of expeditions attempted the climb. Most of them ended in failure or tragedy. The next successful ascent didn't happen until 1970. Led by Chris Bonington, a British expedition took on a new route, a direct climb up Annapurna's south face, which was considered impossible at the time. On May 27, 1970, Dougal Haston and Don Willans reached the summit, paving the way for future climbers. That same year, on May 1st, Junko Tabei, a Japanese mountaineer, became the first woman to conquer Annapurna, proving to the world that greatness in mountaineering knows no gender. After the historic 1950 ascent, the lives of the expedition members took vastly different paths. Maurice Herzog, despite the severe frostbite that led to the amputation of his fingers and toes, became a national hero in France. He dedicated himself to politics, serving as Minister of Youth and Sports. His book, Annapurna, the first 8,000-meter peak, became a bestseller, inspiring countless climbers to chase their own summits. Louis Lachenal, Herzog's closest companion on the climb, also suffered devastating frostbite. But unlike Herzog, he returned to mountaineering. Tragically, his life was cut short. In 1955, he died in a skiing accident in the Alps. Lionel Terray continued his climbing career, making many significant ascents. He became famous for first ascents on previously unclimbed peaks and for writing Conquistadors of the Useless, a book that captured his adventures and philosophy of mountaineering. In 1965, he died in a climbing accident in the French Alps. Gaston Rebouffat was the lucky one. He avoided severe frostbite and went on to pioneer new routes, write books, and make films about mountaineering. His work inspired generations of climbers and helped bring the beauty of the mountains to the world. After the first ascent of Annapurna in 1950, it took a long time before climbers dared to challenge the peak again. Can you imagine? There were 20 years between the first and second successful ascents. In that two-decade gap, only a handful of attempts were made to reach the summit. Most ended in failure or tragedy. So, after that historic first climb of the mighty Annapurna, the next successful expedition took place in 1970. It was a British team led by Chris Bonington, but they had no interest in repeating Herzog's path. While Herzog ascended from the north side, the Brits took on the south face, considered even more dangerous. That first climb had taught them a few critical lessons. First of all, getting to the top is only half the battle. If you don't plan your descent, you're basically holding a one-way ticket. Bonington's team meticulously mapped out their route down, identifying the riskiest sections in advance. They knew their base camp and intermediate camps needed to be secure and dependable. In 1950, the French were in a rush, pitching tents directly on snow without knowing how stable it was. The Brits, on the other hand, were careful to choose safe spots, places that wouldn't turn into death traps during a storm. They also paid close attention to their gear. It had to withstand extreme conditions. It couldn't just be hiking clothes. Sure, that sounds obvious today, almost trivial. But back then, climbers were still figuring out just how brutal the world's highest peaks really were. In 1950, the French team suffered from severe cold and frostbite. Their gear simply wasn't designed for such temperatures. The British learned from that. They used warmer suits and better equipment. Chris Bonington was one of the key figures in mountaineering at the time. experienced, level-headed, and ready to lead his team, no matter how impossible the wall ahead looked. His team included some of Britain's finest climbers. Dougal Haston, tough, resilient, willing to go anywhere if there was even the slightest chance of success. Don Willans, a legendary rock climber known for his incredible technique and his ability to operate on the very edge. Ian Clough, solid, experienced, and no stranger to the Himalayas. But even for him, Annapurna's south face looked like madness. By the time Bonington's team had spent weeks battling the south face, it was clear. This wasn't just a difficult route, it was considered impossible. To survive, they introduced new tactics, fixed ropes, and a chain of high-altitude camps, allowing them to reuse pre-secured sections and reduce risk. But tactics are one thing. The final push is another. May 27, 1970. Dougal Haston and Don Willans launched their summit attack. Steep rock, icy walls, thin air, and a looming monsoon. It was a test of endurance. Every step demanded total focus. But they made it. For the first time in history, climbers conquered Annapurna's south face and reached the summit. However, the victory was short-lived. The team had the taste of success. The hardest part was behind them. Only the descent remained. But in the Himalayas, you don't just come back down. Ian Clough was an experienced alpinist. He had completed many tough routes and was a master of his craft. But experience can't protect you from bad luck. At around 6,500 meters, the team was crossing a slope beneath a hanging glacier. And then, a thunderous roar. The slope shook. A massive chunk of ice broke loose and plummeted downward. Clough was right in its path. He had no chance. The team could only watch as he was buried beneath the ice. Minutes later, it was over. Ian Clough was dead.
It was a tragic end to an extraordinary expedition. They had done the impossible. They had conquered Annapurna, but the mountain spares no one. The south face was climbed, but never truly defeated. That same year, on May 1st, Japanese climber Junko Tabei became the first woman to summit Annapurna, proving to the world that women too are capable of extraordinary feats in the mountains. And here, I'd like to pause. Who was Junko Tabei? If you're picturing a tall, strong, physically powerful woman, that's not the case. She was born in 1939 in the small town of Miharu, Fukushima Prefecture, the fifth of 7 children. Petite, standing at just 150 centimeters, about 4 feet 11 inches. She was often told she was too weak and not built for serious physical challenges. But everything changed when at age 10, she went on a hike up Mount Nasu with her teacher and classmates. That experience was life-changing. The peaks disappearing into the clouds, the cold mountain air, the sense of freedom. She felt the mountains calling to her. At that moment, she didn't know she would one day make history. But one thing was certain. Her heart now belonged to the mountains. At just 10 years old, she fell in love with the mountains and made a promise to herself. Nothing would stand in her way. Spoiler alert, Junko Tabei would later become the first woman in history to summit Mount Everest. But before that, she had other peaks to climb, both literal and societal. In 1958, Junko enrolled at Tokyo's Women's University, where she studied English and American literature, but her true passion was mountaineering. She joined climbing clubs only to face constant prejudice. Men made it clear women don't belong in the mountains. Some even claimed she wasn't there to climb, but to find a husband. Junko didn't argue. She didn't fight back with words. She let her actions speak for her. In 1969, she founded Japan's first women's climbing club. Their motto? Let's go on an expedition abroad, on our own. No men, no stereotypes, no limitations. They would climb not because someone allowed them to, but because they wanted to. That was a radical idea, especially for the time, not just in Japan, but around the world. And Junko meant every word. Just a year later, her club set out for the Himalayas to climb Annapurna. It was the first major expedition made up entirely of women. She traveled to Nepal with a group of female climbers from different countries. Even during training and preparation, they faced criticism and doubt from male climbers who insisted women weren't capable of such a climb. But that only made them more determined. The women went to face an 8,000-meter peak alone. And let me tell you, it was one of the toughest experiences of their lives. A terrifying, almost unimaginable ordeal. The night before the final summit push felt like hell on earth. Imagine 7,500 meters above sea level, minus 30 degrees Celsius. Winds slamming into the tent so hard it felt like it might tear away at any second. Junko and her climbing partner lay inside their sleeping bags, trying to stay warm. All they could hear was the howling wind and the crushing silence. Junko clutched a photo of her daughter. I have to come back. I have to show her that nothing is impossible, she whispered. Her partner, sensing the tension, replied, Junko, we can do this. We've come too far to turn back now. That became their mantra. They knew the next day would bring either triumph or defeat, but retreat was no longer an option. At dawn, the temperature dropped even further. The climbers emerged from the tent, wind-burned faces, eyes squinting against the blinding snow. They checked their gear, radioed base camp. A voice came through the static. You've got this. We believe in you. And then it was just them and the mountain. The first steps were brutal. Deep snow, legs sinking up to the knees. Each step was a battle. Junko felt the lack of oxygen squeezing her lungs. She paused to catch her breath, looked up. The summit looked close, but she knew better. It was an illusion. Just a bit more, just a little further, she repeated to herself. At around 7,800 meters, their worst fear came true. The snowy slope began to tremble, and within seconds, an avalanche struck. Hold on! Junko screamed, grabbing the rope. Snow crashed over them. Thankfully, it wasn't a massive avalanche. They miraculously stayed above the surface. But they were shaken to the core, paralyzed with fear. Junko, shivering, said, We can't stop now. If we stop, we'll never make it. Her partner, pale but determined, nodded. Let's keep going. We're too close to give up. The final 100 meters were hell. The wind roared louder. Snow whipped across their faces like thousands of tiny needles. Junko was on the edge of collapse. Every step took all the focus she had left. She remembered the words her mother always told her. You're stronger than you think. That gave her the strength to push forward, and finally, after hours of struggle, they saw it. The summit Those final steps felt like a lifetime. Barely able to stand, Junko made one last push. She reached the top of Annapurna. Her partner stood beside her. They embraced, laughing and crying at the same time. "We did it! We did it!" Junko shouted, her voice swallowed by the wind. On the summit, silence fell. The wind died down. Endless mountain ranges stretched out before them. Tears froze on Junko's cheeks. She pulled out the photo of her daughter and whispered, "This is for you." In that moment, she understood. Every hardship, every fear, it was all worth it. She hadn't just conquered a mountain. She had proven to herself and to the world that nothing is impossible. But the story didn't end there. The descent was another battle. Exhaustion, freezing cold, oxygen deprivation. Every step was dangerous. Junko knew many climbers die on the way down. She kept telling herself, "I have to make it back. I have to tell this story." When they finally reached base camp, they were welcomed as heroes. Junko, tired beyond words, smiled. She knew this victory wasn't hers alone. It belonged to every woman who ever dared to dream the impossible. And through tears, she admitted, "Annapurna was one of the hardest challenges of my life." Interest in Annapurna only continued to grow after that. For many male climbers, the success of the women's team created a sense of obligation. Now they had to climb the mountain too. But even the best professionals can't control everything. In 1979, a group of British climbers set out for Annapurna to attempt one of its most dangerous routes, the South Face. The team included Peter Boardman, Joe Tasker, Ian Clough, and Alex McIntyre. This wasn't just another climb. It was a test of human limits. They knew the route was deadly, but to turn away from it would be to surrender before even starting. Boardman would later write, "We couldn't ignore the challenge. It felt like a call we simply couldn't silence." For him, it wasn't just about a climbing career. It was about exploring the limits of possibility. Tasker, his partner and friend, saw it as a personal test. "We were like brothers. If anyone could make it up that face, it was us." Clough and McIntyre were less well known, but no less determined. "I knew the risks," Clough said before leaving, "but you don't get many chances to be part of history." The preparation was intense. They studied the route, tested their gear, and planned out every detail. But even the best strategy couldn't guarantee success. Annapurna was infamous for its ruthlessness. "We knew exactly what we were getting into," Boardman recalled. That mountain had already claimed too many lives. Before flying to Nepal, the climbers gathered for a final meeting. One last conversation before the point of no return. Boardman asked, "Are you sure? We might not come back." Clough smiled. "If not us, then who?" The journey to base camp was long and punishing. Altitude shifts, freezing temperatures, constant fatigue from lack of oxygen. Every step felt like a battle, Boardman later wrote. But we knew we had to keep going. As they began establishing their high camps, the mountain showed its true character. An avalanche nearly destroyed their camp, burying tents and just barely missing the climbers. They got out by sheer luck. "It was a warning," Tasker wrote. "This mountain would show no mercy." But they continued. The expedition began in Kathmandu, a bustling, vibrant, chaotic city. It was their first glimpse of Nepal, and it hit them hard. Narrow alleys crowded with people, motorbikes and rickshaws barely squeezing past each other. The air was thick with the smell of spices, smoke, and street food, markets bursting with color, locals smiling at every turn. Kathmandu felt like a different world, Boardman wrote. The adventure had already begun. But the excitement quickly gave way to the reality of logistics. Organizing the expedition took time and energy. They needed permits, Sherpas, gear, food. The bureaucracy was draining. Every day felt like a fight, Boardman remembered, running between offices, pleading with officials, arguing with suppliers, and still not knowing if we'd get out on time. One of the biggest challenges was hiring Sherpas. They demanded high wages, which was fair, considering their work was among the most dangerous in the world. But the expedition had a limited budget, and they had to negotiate. We knew their work was worth every penny, but we were short on funds, Boardman wrote. After days of prep, the team finally set off. The journey to Annapurna's base would take weeks. They trekked through jungles, crossed rivers, climbed rocky mountain paths. Each day felt like a new adventure, Boardman wrote. The mountains were getting closer, and we were getting more exhausted. In remote villages, locals welcomed them warmly, sharing food, stories, and smiles. People here lived like time had stopped, Boardman wrote. These moments helped ease the pain in their legs, the sleepless nights, and constant fatigue. But the hardships continued. Acclimatization was brutal. No one expected the easy sections to be so exhausting. You'd hike for hours with a heavy pack, your lungs straining in the thin air, your heart pounding, and realize this was just the beginning, Boardman wrote. The Sherpas proved invaluable. Their knowledge of the terrain, ability to work in extreme conditions, and sheer endurance made them essential. They weren't just porters. They were part of the team, Boardman wrote. Still, communication wasn't always easy. Language barriers made things more difficult. Some Sherpas spoke basic English. The climbers tried to learn a few Nepali words, but most of the time they relied on gestures. We used pantomime to communicate, Boardman recalled. Sometimes it looked funny, but it worked. There were tense moments, especially when discussing routes. Once, the Sherpas pointed urgently at a slope and made falling motions. Only later did the team realize they were warning about rockfall. Even more complicated were the spiritual beliefs for the Sherpas. The mountains were sacred. If they felt the spirits were angry, they might refuse to continue. They told us the mountains were angry and we needed to stop, Boardman wrote. We respected that, but deep down, we were burning to keep going. They knew if the mountain was angry, they'd have to face it head on. There were tense moments when it came to choosing the route. One time, the Sherpas began urgently pointing toward a slope, making gestures as if something were falling. Only later did the team realize they were warning them about fallen rocks. Even more difficult were the moments when tradition and superstition came into play. For the Sherpas, the mountains were sacred, and if they sensed that the spirits were angry, they might refuse to go any farther. They said the mountains were angry and that we needed to stop. We respected their decision, but deep inside, we were burning with the desire to keep going, Boardman recalled. They understood if the mountains were angry, they'd have to face that head on. The journey to the foot of Annapurna was a true trial. Nature tested the team at every turn. Avalanches, rockfall, sudden temperature drops. One day could be sunny and almost pleasant. The next, an all-out blizzard. The biting cold turned every breath into ice. "We were learning to adapt," wrote Boardman, but the hardest challenge was still ahead. The route took them across several glacial rivers, roaring and churning like living beasts. In spring and summer, when the snow on the peaks began to melt, these rivers became raging torrents, sweeping away everything in their path. Crossing one of them became a critical turning point. There was no way around. Retreat was not an option. The team stood on the riverbank, trying to figure out how to cross the icy torrent. The water roared like a beast. We knew one wrong step, and it would take us, Boardman remembered. The Sherpas suggested building a makeshift bridge with stones and logs, but it would take too long. Waiting wasn't an option. By morning, the water level had dropped slightly, and they decided to wade across. The Sherpas went first. They moved confidently, instinctively knowing where to step and how to fight the current. The climbers watched them with admiration, knowing it would soon be their turn. When Boardman and the others entered the river, fear hit like an icy wave. The current tried to rip them off their feet. Water slammed against their legs and faces. Every step became a struggle. "I could feel my heart pounding," Boardman wrote. "This wasn't just a crossing, it was a battle." Then one of the team members slipped. Everything froze for a split second. He lost his balance, and it looked like the river would drag him away. But at the last moment, he managed to steady himself. Time stopped. "If he had gone under, we wouldn't have been able to pull him back," Boardman recalled. When they finally reached the far bank, their emotions were all over the place. Relief, exhaustion, joy. They were soaked, frozen to the bone, but alive. It was a small triumph. "We made it," Boardman wrote. But the real challenge still lay ahead. When the team reached the base of Annapurna, they were overcome with awe. The mountain towered above them, vast, unapproachable. "It was so enormous we felt insignificant," Boardman wrote. But that awe quickly turned into the realization that now the hardest part was about to begin. From that moment on, the expedition entered a new phase, establishing base camp, distributing gear, acclimatizing. Everything had to be calculated to the smallest detail. Life at base camp followed a strict routine. Mornings began with breakfast and route planning. "It was like a war council," Boardman recalled. "We analyzed the weather, checked on everyone's condition, decided how to move forward." Afternoons were spent gaining elevation. Step by step, the team ascended higher, allowing their bodies to adjust to the thin air. Breathing grew harder, muscles weakened, and each step required more effort. "We knew the better we acclimatized now, the more likely we were to succeed," wrote Boardman. After training climbs came rest and equipment checks. Every knot, every rope, every ice axe was examined with care. "A single gear failure could cost us our lives," Boardman wrote. Evenings were quiet. They sat around the fire, sharing stories, listening to the wind blow across the slopes. This was the last piece before the mountain began its true test. Acclimatization hit the team hard. The altitude sapped their energy. The air grew thinner, and each movement took more out of them. Dizziness, nausea, weakness, these became constant companions. "We knew it was part of the process, but knowing it and feeling your body fight every step, that's something else," Boardman wrote. And soon, one of the team members began to seriously deteriorate. At first, he just looked tired. Then came complaints of a severe headache. Everyone hoped it was temporary, That rest would help. But hour by hour, his condition kept getting worse. By evening, he started vomiting and could barely stand. His eyes were glassy, his movements sluggish. It was like he was in a fog. This wasn't just fatigue anymore, wrote Boardman. The team quickly gathered for an emergency meeting. Everyone understood that at this altitude, there was no time to waste. If it was altitude sickness, any delay could be fatal. We knew we had to act fast. The mountains don't offer second chances, Boardman recalled. The decision was clear. He had to be taken down immediately. The Sherpas didn't hesitate. One of them, a seasoned guide, volunteered to help. He said he knew a safe route down. We were deeply grateful, Boardman wrote. They began the descent at dawn. The illness had weakened the man so badly he could barely move his legs. The team supported him on both sides, helping him over rough terrain. But the biggest danger lay ahead. Once again, the raging glacial river. The water was ice cold, the current brutal. We feared he just wouldn't make it, Boardman remembered. The entire group was on edge. One wrong move and he'd be swept away. They moved slowly and in unison, controlling every step. When they finally reached the opposite bank, no one spoke. They just stood there, breathing deeply, trying to release the tension. That day, the team learned something very clear. The mountains do not forgive mistakes. The sick climber was taken to a nearby village where he received medical help. He survived, but for everyone else, it was a wake-up call. There was no room for overconfidence on Annapurna. After several weeks of acclimatization, the team finally felt ready for the ultimate challenge. The night before the summit push passed in complete silence. Tension filled the tent. No one spoke more than necessary. We knew this was the decisive moment, possibly our only chance, Boardman wrote. Peter Boardman and Joe Tasker sat in the tent, going over the route again. Last checks, last words. We have to be ready for anything. This mountain doesn't forgive mistakes, said Boardman. Tasker nodded. We'll do this together, no turning back. What lay ahead would be the hardest day of their lives. Early morning, the temperature had dropped below minus 30 degrees Celsius. The air was thin. Breathing was hard. The first steps were brutal. Deep snow, sinking up to the knees. Every movement drained their strength, legs burning, muscles cramping. It felt like a steel band was tightening around my chest from the lack of oxygen. But we knew we had to keep moving, wrote Boardman. They climbed higher, slowly, step by step, hacking a path with their ice axes. Then the worst happened. The snow beneath their feet trembled. The slope began to shift. A second later, the silence was shattered by a deafening roar. An avalanche thundered down from above and slammed into them. We heard the roar of the snow, and the next moment it hit us. A force of nature you can't stop or fight, Boardman wrote. When the snow finally settled miraculously, they were alive. No one had died. No one was completely buried. But fear paralyzed them. We knew this was a sign. The mountain didn't want to let us through, he wrote. But there was no turning back. The final summit push began under what felt like impossible conditions. The wind howled like it wanted to throw them off the mountain. The snow stung their faces like needles. The oxygen was nearly gone. We were moving on the edge of what was humanly possible, Boardman wrote. Before the last push, the team split up. Boardman and Tasker took one route. Clough and McIntosh took another. It was a risk, But there was no other choice. The mountain was setting the terms. Clough and McIntosh were tasked with the hardest part of the wall. They chose a technique known as the vertical assault, a method where climbers slowly drive their ice axes and crampons into the ice, inching upward. One mistake would be fatal. The wall was unstable. Massive ice overhangs loomed above them. The strong winds would sometimes knock them off balance. But the plan worked. After days of climbing, setting up intermediate camps, route calculations, and a constant fight against exhaustion, they reached the summit. Annapurna had been conquered, but the most terrifying part still lay ahead. The weather, which had held steady during the ascent, suddenly turned. Winds picked up. Visibility dropped. The temperature plummeted. We knew the descent would be difficult, but we didn't expect it to become fatal, wrote Boardman. On the way down, Clough and McIntosh made a decision that would cost them their lives. They chose not to stop at the high camp, opting instead to descend without resting. They thought they could make it down in a single push. That was their mistake, Boardman wrote. At some point, they likely lost the route. In near zero visibility, with a snowstorm erasing all tracks, it would have been easy. They may have ended up in a dangerous zone without realizing they were walking into a trap, Boardman recalled. There are several theories about what happened. One suggests they entered an avalanche-prone area. We found tracks that ended at the edge of a cliff. It's possible they were hit by an avalanche, he wrote. Another theory, they attempted to descend a steep section, but their gear failed. The search team discovered a snapped rope near a drop-off. When we saw it, our heart sank. It could mean only one thing, Boardman recalled. Nearby, they found abandoned gear, crampons, ice axes. We realized they probably fell, he wrote. The team stood at the edge of the abyss, peering into the void. But there was only silence, just the wind howling between frozen walls. Their bodies were never recovered. The loss of Clough and McIntosh was a shock to the entire team. They had known the risks were immense, but no one wanted to believe it would end like this. We felt guilty. We kept thinking there must have been something we could have done, Boardman wrote. Annapurna had claimed them. Annapurna remains one of the most dangerous peaks in the world. As of August 2015, out of 235 climbers who had reached its summit, 55 had died, making for a fatality rate of around 35%. The main danger lies in the high risk of avalanches on its slopes. In recent years, Annapurna continues to attract climbers from all over the globe. On April 16, 2021, a record was set when 68 people reached the summit in a single day. And that's it, my friends. Annapurna taught me a lot. In the mountains, you don't really conquer the peak, you conquer yourself. Because the greatest summit we ever climb is inside us. Our fears, our doubts, the limits we've imagined for ourselves. Take care of one another, believe in yourselves, and I'll see you on the next trail, friends.